It started on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was staying at my best friend Lisa's house while my own home was undergoing repairs. Her son, Noah, had just turned 18. We'd known each other since he was a little boy, quiet, observant, unusually thoughtful for his age. He still called me Miss Amanda, out of habit, though lately he'd begun dropping the title. Lisa was out working double shifts. Her husband had left years ago, and Noah had grown up a little too fast. My own marriage was hanging by a thread. My husband Daniel hadn't touched me in nearly a year. We spoke in functional tones about groceries and bills. I had convinced myself this was what marriage eventually becomes. One morning, I slipped into Lisa's bathroom to take a shower. I didn't lock the door. It was an old habit, never thinking anyone would barge in. Then it happened. I was rinsing my hair when the door creaked open. "Shit, sorry, I didn't think anyone was in here," Noah stammered, but he didn't shut the door right away. I froze. My heart pounded. Not in fear, but something more complicated. Shame, excitement, confusion. I saw his silhouette standing there for a moment too long before he shut the door. When I came out, towel wrapped tightly, he was sitting at the kitchen table, red-faced, pretending to do homework. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. He avoided me for days afterward until I found him in the backyard, sitting under the patio lights. I sat next to him and we talked about nothing and everything, about how lonely he felt without his dad, about how lost I felt in my own home. We kept talking every night. I told myself it was harmless, just two lonely people filling each other's silence. But when he brushed a strand of hair from my face one evening, I didn't pull away. I should have. We didn't sleep together, not physically, but we did cross a line. Emotionally, deeply, irreversibly. The guilt was unbearable. I started avoiding Lisa. My husband noticed I was brighter, somehow, but he didn't question it. He was glad I had a friend. Eventually, I moved back home. I never told Lisa. I never told anyone, but every now and then I get a message from Noah. Just one word, "thinking of you." I never answer. But I don't block him either, because part of me still thinks about him too. The boundary between emotional safety and emotional danger can often be so faint that we only recognize it once it's been crossed. This is especially true when someone we've known for years, perhaps since childhood, begins to grow into an adult. One whose presence starts to feel different, heavier, more loaded with energy we didn't anticipate. The nature of emotional connection, especially in relationships that are technically safe, like those with family friends, can evolve in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. What starts as casual conversations, shared jokes, or mutual emotional support can slowly turn into something far more intimate. These shifts rarely announce themselves with dramatic flair. Instead, they creep in through quiet moments. An extra glance, a prolonged conversation, a confession shared too vulnerably. Emotional affairs don't begin with a declaration. They begin in spaces where emotional needs aren't being met, and someone else, unexpected and often inappropriate, starts filling those gaps. In this context, the dynamic between a woman and her best friend's son becomes unexpectedly layered. There is trust built from years of familiarity, from babysitting days and holiday dinners. The boy she once knew grows up, his voice deepens, his manner becomes more self-aware, and without warning, he is no longer just a kid. That transformation can catch a person off guard, particularly someone who is emotionally starved, underappreciated in their own marriage, or simply yearning to feel seen. In these emotionally delicate moments, a young man's unexpected maturity or attention can hit with unexpected force. It's not that the woman sets out to see him this way. Rather, it's something that begins emotionally. She starts to feel acknowledged, maybe even admired in a way she hasn't felt in years. It doesn't feel sexual at first. It feels validating. It feels good to be noticed, to laugh again, to have someone listen. These things, while seemingly harmless, lay the groundwork for deeper attachment. The problem is that emotional attachment can mimic intimacy, and intimacy, when not checked, can eventually drift into inappropriate emotional territory, even if no physical lines are crossed. This emotional shift can be further intensified by secrecy. When both people know they are feeling something that they shouldn't, it creates a bond that is powerful and dangerous. Sharing secrets, stolen glances, or even innocent text messages begin to serve as mini adrenaline hits. The fact that no one else knows creates a bubble around them, one that excludes everyone else, including spouses, parents, or friends. That bubble becomes its own world, where logic starts to bend and what feels wrong begins to feel inevitable or even deserved. It's the classic emotional affair loop. They make me feel alive, they understand me, they listen. The truth is that when emotional needs go unmet for too long, the heart starts to look for connection in whatever form it can find. And if that connection comes in the form of someone close but off limits, the tension becomes both intoxicating and destructive. In many real life situations like these, the people involved don't even realize how far they've gone until it's too late. It's not always about a scandalous affair, it's about nights spent texting under the blanket, about moments that linger too long, about emotional dependency that begins to eclipse all else. The friend's teenage son may be legally an adult, but emotionally he is still developing. Meanwhile, the older woman often fails to see how her own emotional fragility is being soothed by someone whose age and vulnerability can make them easy to lean on, but not equipped for the weight of that responsibility. The line between caretaker and confidant blurs. A connection that was once maternal now becomes ambiguous, feeding both people's emotional voids in ways neither expected nor openly acknowledges. At its core, this kind of emotional entanglement is less about lust and more about longing. It's about people clinging to moments that make them feel something when the rest of their world has gone numb. That's what makes it so hard to recognize and even harder to stop, because there's no clear crime, no single act to confess. It's a relationship built on glances, words, and moments that don't belong to anyone else. And when someone feels emotionally invisible in their own life, those moments can feel like lifelines. The danger lies in the fact that these emotional connections often go unchecked until the consequences, whether internal guilt or external discovery, become unavoidable. In many marriages, especially those that have lasted for years or even decades, the emotional fabric that once bound two people together can begin to fray, sometimes without either partner realizing it. What starts as small disconnections, missed date nights, unspoken resentments, routines that take precedence over romance, can quietly erode the intimacy that once came naturally. Over time, couples may begin to live parallel lives, sharing a home, children, responsibilities, but not much else. The affection becomes mechanical, the communication transactional, and the emotional closeness disappears. This emotional starvation doesn't always present as arguments or dramatic fights. In fact, it's often marked by a numbing quiet, where love is replaced by politeness and passion is replaced by routine. For the person living in this emotional vacuum, especially someone who longs to be seen, heard, and understood, the absence of connection becomes a daily ache that's hard to explain but impossible to ignore. It is in this emotional void that the ground becomes fertile for external attachments. When a spouse becomes more of a roommate than a partner, the human need for emotional resonance doesn't vanish. It simply seeks new soil in which to grow. This search is rarely intentional. A woman in a marriage that's gone cold may not be actively seeking someone else, especially not someone wildly inappropriate like her friend's teenage son. But what she is seeking, whether consciously or not, is emotional warmth, recognition, and engagement. When she finds herself being truly seen again, whether through casual conversation or kind attention, it stirs something inside her that she thought had long since gone quiet. Emotional deprivation has a way of intensifying even the smallest gestures. A compliment that might otherwise be brushed off now feels significant. A thoughtful question feels intimate. A shared joke feels exhilarating. The problem becomes more complex when the emotional connection that begins to form isn't with a stranger or a co-worker, but someone within the family's social orbit, someone young, familiar, and typically off-limits. In a cold marriage, it's easy to forget what warmth feels like until it's unexpectedly offered, The friend's son may not have intended anything at first. Maybe he was just being kind, respectful, or curious. But emotional connections are not always formed with intention. Sometimes they are born out of shared loneliness or a moment of vulnerability that hits both people in just the right, or wrong, way. When she begins to confide in him or even just enjoy his attention, it feels like an oasis. For someone who has spent months or years feeling emotionally invisible, these little moments carry immense emotional weight. What complicates matters further is the moral gray zone that such a connection exists in. She knows on some level that it's wrong, not because she's done anything physical, but because of how deeply she now craves his presence. She may find herself thinking about their conversations, replaying them in her head, reading too much into his words. She tells herself it's nothing, that she's just being silly, that it's harmless, but deep down she knows it's become something more. The cracks in her marriage have left her emotionally exposed, and now someone else, even someone so close to the family, has become the balm for wounds she stopped even trying to explain to her husband. In these moments, the contrast becomes painfully clear. Her husband, who used to be her confidant and partner, now barely looks at her with interest. Meanwhile, this boy, this unexpected figure in her life, seems to hang on her every word. The longer the marriage remains emotionally disconnected, the easier it becomes to justify the emotional attachment to someone else. Not because it's the right thing to do, but because it feels necessary for survival. Humans are not designed to live in emotional isolation, especially not within relationships that are supposed to be the primary source of comfort and connection. Emotional neglect can be just as damaging as overt cruelty, and often even more insidious, because it slowly convinces the neglected person that their needs are unreasonable. So when someone finally begins to meet those needs, even a little, the attachment forms quickly and deeply. It's not necessarily about age, attraction, or fantasy. It's about finally being seen. In many real-life cases, this type of emotional entanglement leads people to reevaluate their marriages in painful ways. It's not uncommon for the emotionally neglected partner to suddenly realize just how long they've been lonely. They may become more withdrawn from their spouse, emotionally checked out, even as they continue to play the role of husband or wife in public. At home, though, they begin to live more fully in their thoughts and feelings about the other person, the one who listens, who smiles, who makes them feel alive. This duality, living with one person while emotionally anchored to another, creates deep inner conflict, but also a sense of quiet rebellion against a relationship that has failed to nourish them. The cracks in the marriage, once invisible, now feel cavernous. And often, by the time either partner realizes the damage, the emotional bridge has already been built somewhere else. There are moments in life that change everything, not because of what they are on the surface, but because of what they awaken beneath. A single, seemingly innocent incident can become the catalyst for emotional unraveling, self-reflection, and moral confusion. In the context of a slowly deteriorating relationship or a lonely marriage, a shocking incident, such as a friend's teenage son walking in on a woman while she is in the shower, becomes much more than just an awkward accident. On the surface, it's a brief invasion of privacy, a moment of embarrassment, but when there's already an undercurrent of emotional emptiness or unfulfilled desire, that moment triggers something deeper. It forces the woman to examine not just how exposed she was physically, but how emotionally vulnerable she has become. It brings attention to what has been buried under the routine of domestic life, the need to feel attractive, seen, acknowledged. Things she may not have felt in years, especially within the emotional dead zone of her marriage. In that brief moment of being seen, truly seen, without the protection of clothes, routine, or roles, she feels more exposed than she has in years. Not just her body, but her loneliness, her invisibility, her quiet craving for recognition. The look on the boy's face, the hesitation in his exit, the silence that follows, all of it lingers. It's not about what he saw, but what she felt in that moment, a jolt of something she can't quite define. It's not desire exactly, it's not pleasure either. It's a mix of shock, guilt, curiosity, and a deeply buried need for affirmation that now finds itself suddenly reawakened. And once that door closes literally and metaphorically, she is no longer the same. The line between maternal familiarity and emotional intrigue has been crossed not by action, but by awareness, awareness of possibility, awareness of need, awareness that something has shifted in her, whether she admits it or not. The power of this moment lies in what it forces her to confront. She begins to question things she has tried not to think about. When did she last feel desired? When did anyone last look at her with interest? When was the last time her husband touched her without it feeling like an obligation or a habit? Suddenly, the numbness that had blanketed her for so long begins to crack, and emotions she thought had long since died begin to stir. She becomes more conscious of her movements around the house, more aware of when the boy is nearby, more attuned to the energy that now exists between them. It's not overt, not spoken, but undeniably present. Every shared glance carries more weight. Every word seems to hold a hidden meaning. The moment in the bathroom has unlocked a dimension of emotional complexity that refuses to be shut back inside. She also begins to observe him differently. Not in a predatory way, but in a way that surprises even her. His posture, his expressions, his quiet maturity. Things she never paid attention to before, now stand out. She starts to see him not just as Lisa's son, but as a person with a presence that affects her. This realization is disturbing. It brings guilt, confusion, and shame. But alongside those feelings is a pull, a subtle but undeniable emotional connection that she can't completely dismiss. She knows she shouldn't think of him in any way beyond familial affection, but her mind keeps returning to that moment. Not the nudity, but the pause, the look in his eyes, the way she felt afterward, alive, startled, almost shaken out of emotional sleep. As the days go on, she finds herself drawn to moments of contact, small conversations in the kitchen, accidental touches when passing something, late, night chats that linger a bit too long. Each moment, individually innocent, begins to build a pattern. She starts to anticipate their encounters, replaying their interactions in her head. At the same time, she withdraws emotionally from her husband, feeling more estranged from the lifeless routine they share. She can't bring herself to talk about what happened, not to Lisa, not to her husband, not even to herself in clear terms. It's too dangerous, too messy, too filled with implications that would upend everything. And yet, it lives under the surface, reshaping how she feels in her own skin, how she sees the people around her, and how she understands her own emotional landscape. The incident becomes a turning point, not because of what happened, but because of what it revealed. It forced her to acknowledge the depth of her loneliness and the intensity of her unmet emotional needs. It disrupted the emotional numbness she had accepted as normal. It gave form to the quiet craving she had been living with, one that had gone unspoken for too long. And once that craving is named, even silently, it becomes much harder to ignore. The moment in the shower becomes the start of a quiet, internal transformation, setting off a chain of emotional events that cannot be easily reversed. Secrets, especially those tied to emotional attachments, are often heavier than the most blatant lies. They linger in the mind, taking up space, whispering doubts, shaping decisions, and quietly building walls between people who once shared everything. When emotional boundaries are crossed, even subtly, and especially within familiar circles, like between a woman and her friend's teenage son, the instinct is not to confess, but to bury. This secrecy doesn't just protect reputations or relationships, it becomes a coping mechanism for managing the internal chaos such a connection causes. The shame of admitting that an emotional entanglement has formed with someone so inappropriate and unexpected is paralyzing. It's not always about fear of judgment from others. It's about confronting what it means for one's sense of self. How did it happen? When did things shift? Why did it feel good to be noticed by someone you should only see in familial terms? These are questions that rarely have easy answers, and so silence becomes a shield. But that silence is corrosive. Keeping a secret of this magnitude forces the woman into a constant state of emotional management. She becomes hyper-aware of how she behaves in front of others, especially her husband and her friend. She watches every word, every glance, every interaction with the boy, terrified that someone will see what she feels, or worse, that he will speak about it. The shame begins to manifest physically: tightness in the chest, sleepless nights, guilt that washes over her in unpredictable waves. And yet, despite the fear, there's a part of her that doesn't want to let go of what she felt. That emotional high, the sense of being desired, being seen, it was a rush, a spark she hadn't felt in years. It made her feel alive in a life that had become dull, routine, invisible. Letting that go feels like a death of a different kind, one more silent, but just as painful. The danger of this kind of secret isn't just the risk of being found out. It's the emotional energy it demands to maintain. Pretending that nothing happened or that it didn't mean anything becomes its own performance. She has to engage with her husband while her thoughts are elsewhere. She has to smile and laugh with her friend, all the while knowing there's something under the surface that would destroy everything if it were ever brought to light. Every encounter with the boy becomes laced with unspoken meaning. Even avoidance is a kind of interaction. His silence, her guilt, the distance between them now filled with everything they won't say. She analyzes his behavior endlessly. Does he feel the same? Does he regret what happened? Is he going to tell someone? These unasked questions plague her, not just because of the fear of exposure, but because of the uncertainty they bring to something that has already upended her emotional world. As time goes on, the emotional attachment doesn't necessarily fade, it mutates. It may be buried under responsibility and guilt, but it doesn't disappear. Instead, it becomes part of the emotional architecture of her life. She begins to live in duality, the version of herself that others see, and the version that carries this hidden experience. She may try to convince herself that she has moved on, that it was just a moment of weakness, that she imagined the intensity of it. But then something triggers the memory, an unexpected message, a photo, a glance, and it all floods back, the shame, the thrill, the ache. These reminders are quiet but powerful. They keep the emotional wound from fully healing because it was never treated honestly in the first place. It was hidden, not processed. The weight of keeping the secret eventually takes a toll on how she interacts with everyone around her. Her husband may begin to notice changes in her distractedness, emotional distance, less interest in intimacy. Her friend may pick up on subtle shifts too, sensing discomfort or stiffness in their effortless conversations. The boy himself may either retreat entirely, trying to erase what happened, or may hover silently, his presence a constant reminder. And yet through all of this, nothing is ever said aloud. The emotional consequences are carried alone, in private, where they can't be questioned or resolved. This secrecy, ironically, can deepen the emotional attachment even further. Because no one else knows, the feelings begin to feel sacred in a twisted way, untouchable, misunderstood, uniquely personal. This isolation creates a bond that's difficult to break, even if it was born out of something that should never have happened. And the longer the secret is kept, the harder it becomes to come clean. Not just because of the consequences it would bring, but because it's become so woven into her emotional identity. Confessing would mean tearing apart the life she still tries to maintain, even if it's broken. So she stays silent, living in a constant push and pull between guilt and longing, between protecting the people she loves and nursing the feelings she can't admit. And in that silence, the secret becomes a second life, a quiet, emotional affair that never needed a single touch to be deeply, dangerously real.